Hello and welcome to Season 6, Episode 3 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. And I'm very excited this evening to introduce a new member of the hosting team, Kurt Martin, who is the BirdLife South Africa Communications Manager. Welcome, Kurt.
Hi, Christina, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this, or at least in Joburg, where I am. Very rainy, chilly evening. It's a real privilege to be joining the ranks here at Conservation Conversation. Not for a communications manager. I'm very, very prone to tongue slips, which is maybe not the best trait. But yeah, it's fantastic to be here, and of course, part of BirdLife South Africa in general. Some of you may be familiar with my voice. I did quite a lot of announcements on Flock to Marion. So if you joined us on that voyage, you may be wondering where you recognize my voice from, and that's where it's from. We have over 160 episodes recorded so far, which I think is just remarkable. It's an incredible record of knowledge from conservationists and scientists of all stripes from throughout the country. And yeah, in case you've missed any, going all the way back to I think 2020 or 2021, Christina, 2020. They're all available on YouTube. So just find our YouTube channel, BirdLife South Africa, and you can find each and every conservation conversations so far uploaded there. And make sure you subscribe because then you'll be alerted when future episodes are posted.
Absolutely. And you can also follow BirdLife South Africa on social media, and you can get in touch with us there or on our email address to let us know what you think of the show. And there's also a post-webinar survey at the end of this webinar. So if you can fill that in and let us know what you think, please do.
We aim to keep these webinars free for all of you to learn and enjoy. So if you can, no matter how small an amount, please do consider donating. You can donate through our webpage, which you can see the link for at the bottom of the screen. Otherwise, you can scan that QR code that's being displayed at the moment. So point your smartphone camera at that and follow the link that pops up. Otherwise, you can EFT BirdLife South Africa directly and be sure to use the reference webinars and your name. Thank you for all of those who have donated so far. It's a huge help in keeping these seminars going. And yeah, your support is very valued. So thank you. Evening, we're very excited to be talking about KBAs with Dr. Jarryd Streicher. So he's a postdoctoral researcher at SANBI, aka South African National Biodiversity Institute. That's working alongside us here at BirdLife South Africa and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And his research has included a wide range of things, but at the moment he's focusing on the developing a monitoring framework for South Africa's 263 Key Biodiversity Areas, or KBAs. I'm sure you've all learned by now that in the conservation world, there's a whole lot of TLAs, or three-letter acronyms to memorize. So today we're learning about one of those, which is the KBA. We're also joined by Dr. Lisa van Staden, who is a senior scientist in biodiversity assessment at SANBI, as well as our very own Ernst Retief, who's the landscape conservation manager here at BirdLife South Africa.
Great. Thanks very much, Lisa and Ernst. They will be assisting with some questions after Jarryd's presentation. So in the meantime, Jarryd, you are welcome to start sharing your presentation and yeah, take it away from here.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you again for Kurt and Christina for the introductions. Today, I'll just be giving some introduction to South Africa's Key Biodiversity Areas, a new tool that's internationally recognized. And so let's begin. So South Africa is renowned for its incredible biodiversity, a vast range of species, and unique ecosystems found nowhere else in the world. This rich natural heritage provides essential benefits from clean air and water to food security as well as climate regulation, all of which supports both environment and human well-being. However, human activities such as habitat destruction, pollution, habitat fragmentation, and climate change are putting immense pressures on these environments as well as threatening species. In order to protect biodiversity and ensure a sustainable future, careful management is essential. This includes monitoring changes in ecosystems, species populations, and genetic diversity in order to understand the impacts of environmental change. Reliable biodiversity data with clear indicators helps guide effective conservation efforts, shaping policies and decisions that can safeguard the future of nature for generations to come. So South Africa has a proud history or tradition of systematic conservation planning, which has been instrumental in identifying critical biodiversity areas as well as ecosystem supports areas, which has been allowed the further expansion of protected areas in the country, which is represented within the map. The dark green indicates protected areas. The lighter shade of green is KBAs, and then the more yellowy green color is the ESAs. As well as this, South Africa is party to international conventions requiring us to report on how we look after these important biodiversity areas. But this is often difficult to do without an internationally agreed upon standard, of which defines areas as important for biodiversity. So as global efforts to align biodiversity planning frameworks with internationally recognized standards gains momentum globally, adopting such tools become essential to achieving goals for conservation targets. And these targets include the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So the creation of KBAs occurred in 2016 at the World Conservation Congress in Honolulu, and the guidelines for using the global standard for identifying key biodiversity areas was adopted. The KBA standard was developed by the IUCN and was a process that integrated different existing methods for identifying important sites, including important plant areas, prime butterfly areas, Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, as well as important bird and biodiversity areas. So these are different tools that identify those particular taxon. This standard was adopted into targets and indicators set by the Sustainable Development Goals and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that is why South Africa has decided to apply the KBA standard to be able to communicate on a global level the importance of our biodiversity in a framework that is well understood by everyone globally and comparable. So we've spoken a little bit about some background about key biodiversity areas and their histories and their importance. But what actually is or are KBAs, or key biodiversity areas? Well, they are sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity, whether this be ecosystem types or species. It is based on the criteria developed through transparent consultative process with leading conservationists and species protection stakeholders. The KBA process incorporates elements of biodiversity across species, whether this be birds, reptiles, plants, mammals, invertebrates, butterflies, as well as ecosystem types, and applies in different realms, including terrestrial, freshwater, marine, subterranean. KBAs have the potential to provide an effective bridge between the assessment process and the conservation planning, and is an important step towards conservation action, both locally and internationally. So before we go ahead, we now have a brief overview of what a key biodiversity area is, but it's important to get some definitions before we proceed with the presentation further. So a KBA, or the definition of a KBA site, or KBAs are sites with delineated boundaries. So these are boundaries that represent a particular site, and they've been mapped out according to the global KBA standard, which defines a site as a geographical area on land and or on water with a defined boundary that is actually or potentially manageable as a single unit, whether this is potentially a protected area in the future or other managed conservation units in the future. It's important also to emphasize that key biodiversity areas or sites with delineated boundaries, which differ from more traditional systematic conservation planning, which doesn't explicitly define boundaries of important sites. So we now have a definition for a key biodiversity site, and it has a defined boundary. We also need to look into some of the criteria and threshold which are used in order to classify and identify a key biodiversity area. So collectively, the criteria aim to capture various ways in which a site can be important for the global persistence of biodiversity. In all sites should be assessed against as many KBA criteria for as many taxonomic groups, like we mentioned earlier. So those are all your different species within the various taxonomic groups and ecosystem types as possible. And in order for a site to classify as a KBA, it only needs to meet one criterion for either a species or an ecosystem type. But as I mentioned, it needs to be assessed against as many criteria and taxonomic groups as possible. So we're going to go through individually each of the 5 broad criteria from A to E for classifying a KBA. Firstly, we have threatened biodiversity. So these are sites of criterion A and are important for global threatened biodiversity. They hold a significant proportion of the global population of species at risk of extinction, or a significant proportion of an ecosystem type at risk of collapse. They constitute threatened species and ecosystem types based on the IUCN International Red Listing, and they include vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered species and ecosystem types. Next, we have geographically restricted biodiversity. These are sites that are triggered by criterion B and are important for biodiversity that is geographically restricted. These sites hold significant proportions of the global population of an individual, either of an individual, geographically restricted species, co-occurring restricted range of species, geographically restricted species assemblage, that's an assemblage of different taxonomic groups, or a geographically restricted ecosystem type. These can namely be seen as endemic species, which South Africa has many of them, which are range restricted. And I'll build more on that a bit later when we start looking at the triggers and the results from the systematic review. The next criteria we have is ecological integrity. This is criterion C, and these sites have outstanding ecological integrity at a global scale. The extent to which an ecosystem structure, function, and composition match historical or high-quality reference conditions that support biodiversity and remain largely unaffected by threats. So the next criterion D, which relates to biological processes, are sites that triggered by criterion D maintain important biological processes that are geographically restricted to a site. These include processes such as aggregations, refugia sites, as well as recruitment sites of these important areas. And one can look at the example as for an aggregation site as a site for seabirds, or a breeding site for seabirds on islands. And these are great aggregation sites that are incredibly important. Lastly and finally, we have irreplaceability through quantitative analysis. So the sites that trigger criterion E have very high irreplaceability for global persistence of biodiversity, as identified through a complementary-based quantitative analysis of irreplaceability, using techniques derived from systematic conservation. So we've quickly gone through the different KBA criteria, and within the criteria, there are 11 sub-criteria which have associated thresholds that must be met in order for a site to be classified as a key biodiversity area. I won't go into those details because it's a lot of numbers and stats, and those are better to be looked at by people that are more interested in the technical side. So we have a brief overview of some of the definitions and the requirements for KBAs. So how does this involvement work within South Africa? Well, SANBI and BirdLife, along with other role players, have been working on applying the KBA process in South Africa since 2017. So it's been a mammoth task. What went into mapping KBAs and listing various taxonomic groups of interest and ecosystems is a great achievement for conservation in South Africa. Experts ranging from species to taxonomic specialists, ecosystem specialists, and spatial planning specialists were engaged in order to find solutions to best incorporate key biodiversity areas in a megadiverse South African context. So it was a great chance to see how this internationally recognized tool could be used within South Africa. So what was performed? Well, a comprehensive systematic national KBA assessment was performed using national data sets for trigger elements. We applied the KBA criteria to 385 endemic ecosystem types and more than 6,500 species, ranging from various taxonomic groups, including amphibians, birds, freshwater, fish, butterflies, mammals, dragonflies, reptiles, plants, and other selected invertebrate species, which we had data on. What I want to point out before we proceed to the next slide are these potential, when we started setting up the assessment, these trigger-rich element sites, and this will relate later when we look at the final KBA map output. So we can see a lot along these trigger-rich elements along the west coast, as well as in the interior of KwaZulu-Natal, near the Drakensberg Mountains. Through the assessment process, we identified the importance of occurrence records and how useful they can be for confirming both presence and reproductive units for trigger species. And this once again highlights the importance of citizen science projects, getting data from those projects such as Southern African Bird Atlas Project, Bird Lasso, iNaturalist, as well as national assessments and various monitoring programs across the different taxonomic groups and ecosystems for recording occurrence data that can be run through the models and help identify trigger species for the identification, the delineation, and confirmation of key biodiversity areas in the country. So what do the key biodiversity areas in South Africa look like? Well, it's not new science, but we know that South Africa has exceptional biodiversity with high species richness, as well as high levels of endism and diverse ecosystem types. South Africa was the first nation to implement all 5 of the KBA criteria, so that criteria that I mentioned earlier from A to E, we're the first country to implement it all. In terms of the coverage of these key biodiversity areas and their delineation, it covers approximately 358,000 square kilometers, which if you add them all together is roughly the same size as the European country of Germany. Of these sites, approximately 28% of them fall under formal protection. In the process, we identified 3,486 trigger species, as well as 323 trigger ecosystems. So those are trigger species and ecosystems that met the international standard criteria for KBAs. In terms of the number of KBAs, we were ranked 3rd in the world for the number of sites, only behind the United States of America and Australia. And we are still yet to map our marine key biodiversity areas. So these are explicitly terrestrial key biodiversity areas, which shows that hopefully one day we'll be able to surpass Australia and the United States and become number 1 in the world for the number of key biodiversity areas we have. So all in all, we've identified 263 confirmed key biodiversity areas that are internationally recognized for their importance for the persistence of biodiversity, with 26 still unconfirmed meaning that we lack some data for meeting components of the criteria. And there's also a process underway for identifying marine KBAs, and I'll expand a little bit on that a little bit later when we look at some future projects. So we can see from the map, if we look at the west coast of South Africa, we can see high numbers of trigger elements, and this is namely due to endemic and range-restricted species within the Western Cape, along the coastline, as well as high areas within the Drakensberg zone. So this little figure on the right-hand side of the page shows the different criteria from A to E, and the bottom of the axis gives the number of triggers. In the legend, we have the different taxonomic groups of interest. What we can see from this figure is the main drivers of the triggers for South Africa. And for South Africa, it is mainly be driven by the high concentration of range-restricted endemic species and ecosystems, indicated by the criterion Bs, as well as high levels of irreplaceability through quantitative analysis, which is criterion E. So that's where all the triggers came from and the confirmation process for key biodiversity areas. So I am doing a presentation on birds. So I thought let's do a little bit of work and some focus from the KBAs on some bird triggers. And how does this relate to birds in South Africa? So we identified 448 bird species triggers, which cover 53 bird species across 113 KBA sites. So roughly half of the KBA sites have bird-related triggers within them. Notably, Prince Edward Island had the highest number of bird triggers out of all the KBAs. And notably, it is an important site for biologically threatened species, such as the sooty albatross, the Indian yellow-nosed albatross, and the grey-headed albatross, as well as vulnerable species, including the wandering albatross, the southern rockhopper penguin, and the macaroni penguin. So quite incredible looking birds. And this Prince Edward Island is important for site for biological processes, which I spoke about earlier, of demographic aggregation sites for these birds individually, and as well as these species co-occurring and being geographically restricted, which is criterion B. So moving back to our focus on the bird triggers, the most represented species was the black harrier, and overall the most represented trigger for bird-related KBAs is geographically restricted assemblages with 142 triggers. So if we look at all the bird sites, approximately 13% of all KBAs triggers are bird-related. There's been a lot of, in terms of the red listing, the KBA process has come under a bit of strain because many people think that it focuses strictly on highly threatened species, such as your critically endangered and endangered species. But what we can see from the figure in terms of focusing on birds species in particular, you can see that quite a wide range of endangered species with varying endangered levels are included within the KBA process. So this is nice to see how holistically the tool is used and how it is able to identify sites for a range of different species types in terms of their red listing. So next we'll be moving to a couple of important sites, particularly for BirdLife, some grassland sites in South Africa. And our first site is the Wakkerstroom, which is a vast, largely unprotected natural area spanning KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga, and it forms part of the escarpment linking southern and northern Drakensberg, with landscapes of rolling grasslands and low mountains and wide valleys. So the region is dominated by short montane grasses, while dense oldwood thickets, small forests thrive on steep sheltered slopes, and includes various important wetland sites. So if we look at Wakkerstroom KBA in a bit more detail, You can see the delineation covers an area of just over 5,000 square kilometers. This particular site has limited formal protection. However, the site qualifies for 3 KBA criteria, namely threatened biodiversity, geographically restricted biodiversity, and irreplaceability through quantitative analysis. The site also supports 29 species which covers a range of taxonomic groups, including birds, butterflies, fish, and plants, and also contains a significant proportion of threatened or geographically restricted ecosystem types, which are listed there below, ranging from least concern to endangered. In terms of the delineation, the map we saw earlier and zoomed into is a refinement of the existing important bird and biodiversity areas, the IBA, and includes a large protected environment of intact grassland, vegetation, and numerous important wetlands. It is also partly characterized as a critical biodiversity area, as well as a strategic water source area. So moving on from Wakkerstroom, we're going to look at another grassland site, or grassland terrestrial dominated site, which is the Drakensberg, which is a large terrestrial KBA site with this time substantial protection found in KwaZulu-Natal. This site includes species-rich grasslands and at varying levels of density. So the Drakensberg is characterized by deep basalt rock faces and terraces that are some of the most imposing array of cliffs in southern Africa, as well as the sandstone cliffs in the foothills are a major characteristic of the landscape. And this creates a multitude of special habitats for many localized plant species. So we look at this KBA site in a bit more detail and how it was classified. We look at its delineation. It covers a range just over 3,200 square kilometers. In terms of protection, the site has substantial formal protection, the Maluti-Drakensberg region. In terms of the rationale why the site qualifies as a KBA, it meets 3 of the KBA criteria, similar to Wakkerstroom for threatened biodiversity, geographically restricted biodiversity, and then irreplaceability through quantitative analysis. The site supports 70 species of global significance, and these include amphibians, birds, butterflies, dragonflies, fish, plants, as well as a couple of reptiles. It also contains a significant proportion of geographically restricted ecosystem types. And if anyone's been to the Drakensberg, you know how important those grassland systems are, particularly for water security within the country. In terms of delineation, so the boundaries and the mapping of the site, the delineation follows the large mountain protected area complex, as well as its immediate surroundings. So we've looked at 2 large grassland and wetland KBA sites within South Africa, and how do these relate to a couple of bird species of interest. So these are a number of bird species that are KBA triggers within those sites. And of the terrestrial birds, core populations of most of South Africa's threatened and endemic grassland species are present in those sites. And it highlights the importance of these sites as key biodiversity areas for the persistence of these grassland and wetlands bird species. So running from the top left, we have the black harrier. Next is the white-winged flufftail, which BirdLife South Africa has been doing a lot of work on, as well as the mountain pipit, the Drakensberg siskin. The next row, going from left to right, we have the southern-bald ibis, the bush blackcap, the Rudy's lark and Botha's lark. And then finally, the last row, we have wattled crane, crowned crane, yellow-breasted pipit, and finally our national bird, the blue crane. So these sites are particularly important for the persistence of these grassland and wetland specialists. So we've covered a few examples of key biodiversity areas and some grassland sites within South Africa, but there also exists a number of resources that are available. for people that are interested to explore a little bit more detail about key biodiversity areas. So firstly, we have the Key Biodiversity website, which is on the left. And this site provides a lot of resources and information ranging from publications, as well as information on data sites, which is freely accessible. And if people are interested, are welcome to visit that site for more information. Next, we have the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, which is in the middle. This site is where proposing from the National Coordinator Group is submitted, as well as viewing all the data sets are stored in the repository. Lastly, the sites of interest we have is the Conservation Training Platform, which allows people to learn more about KBAs, as well as to run through the process of how to identify KBA, going through all the criteria, the process of submitting and proposing the KBAs. And so there's a really useful resource to learn more about KBAs actively. So what I have done here is I've attached the various web links to the different web pages. If you're welcome to visit them and engage with the resources, as well as if you have a smartphone, you're welcome to scan the QR codes. These will take you directly to the websites. At the moment, they've been developed in a variety of languages, including obviously English and French and German. But we're hoping that we can maybe get a South African flavor and get some South African languages represented in the future to make it more accessible. So these are the international KBA resources that are available. But if we look locally, SANBI has a KBA webpage that they've set up, which provides just a broad overview of KBA's country, the what, the how, the when, and the where, and as well as their biological importance. We also have various sections where you can find out more information about a KBA map, as well as a fact sheet with associated information. We also have a frequently asked question document where you're able to learn more about key biodiversity areas if your questions aren't answered within the web page. And for more in-depth technical summary of the KBA criteria, we have a number of links that one can visit, as well as reading the KBA Global Standard, which gives guidelines of how the KBA or key biodiversity process works. So that's for more technical users. They're welcome to engage with. And next we have, as well as we have the KBA shapefile for South Africa. So all the key biodiversity sites, shapefile is downloadable from the web page, and you're able to use that data set for mapping those sites within a geographical information system programs such as Google Earth, as well as QGIS and so on. So that's very useful for spatial planners. I also have my email address there. So if you have any questions which aren't answered by the web page, you're welcome to send me some emails. Hopefully I can get to them timelessly. So those are the resources in terms of South African KBA webpage. There's also a QR code you're welcome to scan. It links you straight to the webpage. So we've learned a little bit about KBAs. We've gone through a couple of sites. We've gone through a couple of resources that are available. So what are the actual uses of KBAs for conservation? This is really important. And they can help guide future conservation planning in South Africa in conjunction with existing spatial planning tools in South Africa, and this will overall strengthen conservation in South Africa. So it's a complementary tool to be used in conjunction with existing spatial planning tools, which I spoke about at the beginning of the presentation. They also have the potential to support environmental impact assessments. So KBAs could potentially play a role in EIAs by using presence of trigger species and ecosystem types as indicators of ecological sensitivity. And this potentially can help decision makers evaluate the potential risks to biodiversity and prioritizing conservation in high impact areas before approving development projects. So similar to the process in IBAs, we're hoping that the KBAs in the future can be utilized in the same manner. They can also be used to inform conservation action. So the KBAs, as we've gone through the presentation today, highlight key sites that can require attention, and conservation organizations can focus their efforts towards these sites as they are globally recognized for the persistence of biodiversity. And lastly, they can promote research and monitoring. By identifying sites of ecological importance, key biodiversity areas can help steer future research on for trigger species as well as ecosystems, as well as long-term monitoring within these areas could provide valuable data that informs adaptive conservation strategies and strengthens conservation on the whole for South Africa. So those are some broad uses for KBAs in conservation for South Africa. We're hoping that in the future that there's quite a large buy-in for that. But we also have a number of future projects we are planning to run. Part of the KBA process is that the site requires a reassessment every 8 to 12 years, and therefore the site requires monitoring to ensure that the species that were identified as triggers during the assessment process still remain as triggers. And so this requires a large monitoring protocol to be developed and to be implemented in the country. And data from that needs to be recent within that assessment process. We're also looking to do marine KBA sites within the country, so to identify and delineate those sites and get them confirmed by the International KBA Secretariat. And linking to the KBA monitoring program, we want to establish potential friend groups in order to assist with monitoring of key sites and from a range of different taxonomic groups. Also planning on doing or arrange a couple of popular articles from local magazines just to get more buy-in and to grow more awareness about this natural heritage that we have in the country and the global importance of these various sites. We have a great communication team, and so they are working hard to set up some social media posts to use some of the fantastic pictures and sites that we have thus far. As well as in the future, we're going to develop a film documentary in which can engage a wider audience about key biodiversity areas, explain some of the information behind it, the processes by KBAs. So part of this growing awareness campaign is we're hoping to develop some info sheets, and these info sheets would be great to look at the various key biodiversity areas in South Africa, to highlight and give an overview of what a key biodiversity area is. And we're hoping in the future to develop a number of top 10 sites, including some plants, mammals, and birds and butterfly specific KBAs. We've almost finished, and we were hoping to get them out by today, but it didn't work out. But we've just about almost finished our KBA sites for each province. So these are key biodiversity areas for each province info sheets, which look like the one on the right, which we're going to release shortly. And hopefully this allows us to grow more awareness about key biodiversity areas and appreciation from the general public. These will be shared in various formats, so digitally via PDF or a glossy brochure. And we're hoping at particular sites that we're able to set up posters, if appropriate. We can set up posters, big A1 poster of the info sheets, so that people can engage with the material. What we have found during the process of making the info sheets is that we often lack high quality pictures. We know that the general public do have very good photography skills, and this is just a public request for developing a database in order to pull various pictures from them to use them within these info sheets. So all in all, that is the general overview of key biodiversity areas in South Africa. We covered a range of topics from a little bit of the history to its implementation in South Africa, and the reassessment and assessment process, as well as covering a couple of sites, these grassland important sites which BirdLife South Africa have worked on, and then rounding off with some future conservation opportunities to plug KBAs into, as well as some future projects that we're going to do. So before I finish my presentation, I just want to give a big thanks and mention to SANBI and BirdLife and other KBA partners that were involved in the key biodiversity assessment for the country. I also want to thank the various stakeholders and experts that contributed their expertise and time towards the project. It was a massive project, and it took a number of years to complete. And lastly, the core KBA members, Dr. Lisa van Staden, Dr. Andrew Schockner, and Adams Retief, for setting up the foundation and developing the KBA network for South Africa, who did all the heavy pushing for key biodiversity areas for South Africa. So thank you again, and thank you for your attention. And I think now we link off into our Q&A session, where we have Dr. Lisa van Staden standing by, as well as Adams Retief, who are able to help with the Q&A session. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jarryd. That was a great overview of KBAs. Thanks very much for sharing the work that you've been doing, and explaining what these important areas are to everyone. So we do have some questions coming in. And just a reminder to all of our viewers, if you do have any questions for Jarryd or Ernst or Lisa, please do put them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat feed, as we can keep track of them more easily in the Q&A box. So I think I will kick it off with a question from Veline. And I think Lisa might be best placed to answer this. The question is, why would the bearded vulture not be a trigger for the Drakensberg KBA?
Good evening, everyone. Hi, Evelyn. Thank you for an interesting question. So the bearded vulture is definitely a species of conservation concern. Its population is declining globally. But according to the IUCN Red List, it's in the near threatened category. So that means it's not yet considered at high risk of extinction. And how the KBA criteria work is that for a species to be a trigger at a site, a minimum proportion of the global population of the species must be present in the site before it can be qualifying as a trigger. And when it comes to threatened species, so those that are at high risk of extinction, the thresholds are quite low. So there needs to be only a reasonably small but persistent population can still trigger a site. But when species are not yet in danger of extinction, there needs to be 10% of the global population of the species minimum in the site for it to be a trigger. And the bearded vulture, even though it's got globally quite a small population, and it is something that we're worried about, the Drakensberg just doesn't have that 10% of the global population for it to be a trigger. And so it is a species that we are worried about, and the Drakensberg is a good area for its conservation, but in terms of how the KBA standard and the criteria is defined, it just doesn't make the threshold.
Great, thanks for that, Lisa. It can be quite complicated with the various thresholds and triggers, and it's not as clear cut as it may first seem by having, a threatened or rare species in an area. So thanks for that clarification.
Thanks. I just wanted to jump in and also offer my thanks for a very fascinating presentation. I can see in the chats that everyone seemed to enjoy it too, although someone has requested a a focus on marine KBAs. So I don't know if you want to talk about that for a second, Jarryd.
The marine KBAs, well, we haven't developed them just yet. I know that we require a number of expertise to look at the marine sites. So it is a future project that we're going to look into and identify and delineating that. But it is largely data derived and driven. So as you saw from that occurrence records map, those occurrence records really help with identifying key biodiversity areas. So we need to collate and pull all that information and run them through the various criteria and the associated thresholds before we can identify them. But it is something that's happening in the future, and we are going to be working on it soon. So this is one of the future projects.
Exciting, yeah. Well, we'll keep our eyes peeled, and when there's someone who can talk about marine KBAs, we'll definitely have them on here. So, yeah, keep your inboxes checked for future conservation conversations. Yeah.
Absolutely. I also look forward to having some marine KBAs identified. So now there's a question from Ray asking about your map, Jarryd, of the KBAs, asking whether the blank areas in the KBA map reflect poor data availability. So maybe you can just speak to the map again.
Doesn't necessarily mean poor data availability. It just means it could be a combination of lack of data, but most realistically, it's a lack of trigger elements within the sites. And so we expanded on the graph, which explained a number of our trigger elements. A lot of the concentrations were actually because of geographically restricted species, so high endemic areas, and those were highlighted within the Cape Fold Mountains as well as the Drakensberg. So that's a main driver for that arrangement of the KBA maps and that site, where we have a lot of sort of homogeneous landscape that go through the center of the country. So we don't get the wide diversity of species that are geographically restricted. So it's that, as well as potential data deficiencies. But as you saw from the occurrence records, we have quite a large occurrence records that cover the array of South Africa. So for the database that Lisa has set up, which is a massive task, there's over 2 million data points of various species. And so we have a lot of information. So yeah, it could be both ways.
It brings up a question I had. So it's, I guess, the opposite question for places like the Cape Fold Belt and the Drakensberg mountain range. Is it largely to do with, the geographical nature of those areas that create so many like biodiversity hotspots? Is it a thing of a lot of range restricted species occurring in those areas, or what exactly is it that makes those areas so dark red, I suppose, on the map?
Yes, so it's namely the topography. So the Cape Fold Mountains, which developed there, created a landscape of undulating altitude, which allowed and separated, caused a bit of speciation by biogeography, island theory. And so that resulted in a lot of diversification of species. And species became range restricted because of the mountain landscapes, both in the Cape Fold Mountains as well as Drakensberg. And that's why we have those highly endemic regions that are species rich, with various fanewort species and some of the most species rich areas in the country. And we also, from a resulting that, we have specialization of various taxonomic groups, from birds to insects, which include moths and butterflies. And so that whole process historically allowed for there to be a lot of diversification of species.
I suppose so. And does the sort of harshness of those environments, which prevents, wide scale human habitation to an extent, does that have a role as well?
Probably, because humans do have the pillage and plunder sort of mindset. So we do homogenize landscapes, we fragment them, we degrade them. So them being harsh environments does preclude humans, as well as farming and agriculture, which would allow the species to persist in those sites. I don't know how many people want to live on the top of the Drakensberg Mountains or the Cape Fold Mountains. So yeah, it's a pretty harsh environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Christina's got a question in the chamber there.
I do. So this is a question from Rael, and it's actually a two-part question. So I'll ask the first part because I think otherwise we'll get a bit lost. And maybe Ernst would like to answer this, but feel free to pass it on if you don't, Ernst. So many of our viewers might be more familiar with the important birds and biodiversity areas, the IBAs. So the question is, to what extent has the KBA framework replaced the IBA standards? And are the IBAs still valid?
Thanks, Ralph, for the question, and great to meet you again. Yeah, so as BirdLife South Africa, we've decided to move away from IBAs, and I don't want to go into the full discussion here why we've made that decision. But yeah, when we start evaluating the KBA network, we did consider the IBA network. So part of my job in this process was to overlay the KBA network or the draft KBA network with IBAs and determine which of the IBAs didn't qualify as KBAs at that point. And so we created some new KBAs to cover some of them. But most of our IBAs, I don't have the exact statistics, but most of our IBAs are actually now KBAs. Some of them might have been combined or split or two. But most of the area of our old IBA network is now covered by the KBA network. And for a few IBAs which not covered, they would most probably not qualify as IBAs also if we did a reassessment. But yeah, there's many other reasons that I think the KBA network is just now more widely accepted and by a wider community. It is a great tool for using for funding applications, etc., etc. And also, I think somebody mentioned earlier about all the acronyms in the conservation world in South Africa. To have IBAs, KBAs, CBAs, and I don't know what else. It just makes sense to combine all our efforts into KBAs. As BirdLife South Africa, we will focus on just some of the 263 KBAs, those that are really important for IBA, for birds, and those IBA or KBAs where we work in. So this is a job for me this year, is to identify those KBAs, and Jarryd is actually going to help me a bit with that. But yeah, so we don't have any IBAs anymore in South Africa. We now only have KBAs.
Great, thanks for that. It does make sense to combine and, as you say, reduce the number of acronyms. And I think having key biodiversity areas that are important for more species than just birds possibly carries a bit more weight in terms of trying to get them protected or preventing developments or that kind of thing. So part two of the question is your figure of 28% protected, does that pertain to the extent of protected habitat within the KBAs or the coverage of the KBAs overall in the context of the South African land area? And saying this is relevant to the protected area expansion targets implemented by SANBI. So I'm not sure who would be best placed to answer that question.
I can answer it. So it's the second part that pertains to the extent of the protected habitat within the KBA. Sorry, it's the coverage of the KBA overall in context of South African land area. And so those protected areas currently are the current protected area coverage that is implemented by SANBI. So that's the current measure. We're hoping in the futures with the vast array of key biodiversity areas that we pointed out tonight, that this can aid protected area coverage in the future as we've identified these sites that are internationally recognized and globally appreciated for the headline of for the persistence of biodiversity of these various species and ecosystem types.
Great, thanks for that.
There's an interesting question here from an Anthony. He asks if KBAs give any formal clout. Do they come with any clout in terms of legislation towards their protection, or is it more just a way of understanding biodiversity, creating what he says a heads up for environmental assessments? So, does it just shine a spotlight on these areas and highlight them as places that are particularly important?
I can answer that question. So it's similar to the IBAs. The IBAs didn't have any legal status, but they were in listing notice 3, and they did form part of the EIA process where they were considered before developments could take part. So we're hoping to get them adopted in the future. But what we need to also remember, like the IBAs, KBAs are internationally recognized and an international standard, which throws a lot of weight behind them. It doesn't undermine our local and regional conservation planning, which is a great effort from South Africa, but they are internationally recognized sites, and we're hoping in the future that this is able to develop further in terms of protected area expansion. That's the ultimate goal, whether it be protected area or OECM expansion.
But as it stands, it's not automatically creating new national parks everywhere you look, which would be wonderful. Yeah. I suppose a way of thinking of it is that, like, if each existing KBA were to be, very formally and strongly protected, that would be the best possible case from a conservation standpoint. It's like the places that most deserve it and most need it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I've lost track of the question I wanted to ask next. So kind of linked to that last question, Tian firstly says, very informative talk, thank you. And then, so you've touched on the EIA legislation, but Tian asks, beyond broad processes, what concrete steps are being taken to formally integrate KBAs into EIA legislation? And are there any specific policy changes or legal mechanisms where KBAs have already influenced EIA decisions? I'm not sure who to direct that to.
So I can give a quick go. So people must understand the KBA network was declared only a few months ago. So there's still a lot of discussion as to the way forward with them and how they will, for instance, they will be included in the site screening tool, for instance, of the National Environmental Department in legislation, and how we will consider this. So this is all new. I don't know of any EI assessments which would already have been impacted by. It's far too early. But interesting to know if you already had people in, a lot of EI practitioners that ask us how can they use KBAs in EI assessments and so on. So they're already considering it, but it's very, very early days.
That's good to know. It's good to know people are already awake to the fact that KBAs exist.
Ali Mutsu's asked the question twice, so I think they're quite keen for an answer. I don't know exactly who could answer this, but they feel that they're seeing less bird life in Tongaat over the migration season this year. I don't know if anyone has any insights as to why that may be.
I can maybe give a go. So as we say in the, birds move around in space and time. So birds move, based on environmental conditions, where there's food, where there's water, and it's one of the things that makes birds complicated to understand, to conserve, is that one year there can be a lot of them at point X, and the next year there's a drought, and then there could be fewer of them. So you might be quite correct that maybe there's a few migratory species in that specific area this year, but it might also be that they just move to another area for a while. So hopefully they'll be back next year. Yeah, so as I said, it happens all the time that birds move around, and the numbers fluctuate quite significantly. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But these are the sort of things that we monitor for citizen scientists, that we can get the long-term trends. So if we get for many years lower bird numbers in Tongaat, then there's a problem, and then we can start investigate and look into that. But just for one season, it might just be a temporary move by the species.
I invite you to talk just a little bit longer on citizen science and the importance of citizen science tracking these kind of data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jarryd did mention it during talk that in this process to define KBAs, we use a lot of citizen science data, not only bird data, but plant data. I mean, it was just amazing. I think it in one sense also complicated the process a little bit for Lisa and Andrew and so on that work on a process for they had such a massive amount of data to work through. It is just we were so lucky in South Africa to have all this data. If you look at other countries, they struggle to get data, so we had a lot of data. But for a country like South Africa that's so large, we need a lot of data. And, we don't have enough professionals to collect this data. So we need citizens of South Africa, birders and people interested in plants and butterflies and snakes to collect the data for us and to record it. So for birds, we record it in BirdLife and SABAP2 and so on. And for other taxa, it's, you need, for example, use iNaturalist to submit your data. And there's a CREW program. There's all these sort of interesting projects that people can participate in and to collect the data. And I just want to make this point. We've now defined the KBA network, but this is actually the easy part. These are the last points. But to conserve these areas and to monitor them now, this is the big task. This is a task that's now ahead of us to conserve these KBAs and to monitor them. And for that, we need to continue to collect data. And so I would really like to invite everybody to go and identify your KBA. If you live in a KBA, and start collecting data, start submitting it to SABAP2 and to iNaturalist, go and photograph the grasses and insects and stuff and submit the data. And we then can use the data to monitor the KBAs going forward.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important initiative. And so, yeah, thanks for telling us a bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks very much. So we are after 8 o'clock, but I think we'll, if everyone's okay with it, just answer a couple more questions. And this one from Krista is actually not so much a question as an observation about the Jarryd, you said that South Africa was third in the world with a number of KBA sites, and he was pointing out that we are, if you take into account the surface area of the country, we're actually in first place because we're smaller than Australia and the US, and so if you proportionally, then we're out on top. Do you have any comments on that?
I think that's a great observation, and as any scientist, I'll double check. But yes, it's. I was strictly just mentioning the numbers, but in terms of surface area, that could be the case. And I'll probably go tomorrow morning and work it out and see where we do rank. But yeah, thank you very much, Krista, for the question.
Yeah, it's always good to fly the proudly South African flag to celebrate our biodiversity in this country. Kurt, did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, well, there's a Rosalind who's wondering how to understand if their farm falls within the Western Cape, within a Western Cape KBA. How could they find out about that? Which website would you direct them to, or resource? Or
So to see if their farm falls within the KBA sites, those shape files are all available on the SANBI webpage, where you can download them and then you can view them using Google Earth, and you can zoom in into your site where you live. And then also it is also accessible on the KBA Biodiversity Area site as well. Yeah, so you can access all that information online and to see where these areas fall with more detail.
I hope Rosalind is familiar with what the farm looks like from above. Lisa, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I just want to add that one of those websites that Jarryd showed during his presentations, the global website. There's the one about the key biodiversity areas where you can do a map search. And then you can zoom in. If you know where in the map of South Africa your farm is, you can basically, like you zoom into your Google Maps or something like that, you can look around the map and look for your farm, and then you would be able to see whether it's within a key biodiversity area, and you don't need to download shape files if you don't have a way of working with shape files. It's an easy process that anybody can use.
Thanks for
Thanks.
that.
Yeah. Well,
And I
I
see
hope it
Ernst.
answers.
Yeah, sorry. I see Ernst
Aaron,
has
did
put
Ernst
a
put the
link
link in?
chat.
That's nice. Thank you, Ernst.
Mm.
Yeah. If you haven't noticed in the webinar chat, Ernst has added a URL which should take you to a site, to a page where you should be able to figure out the definitions of the KBA areas.
And so there's one more question from Anthony. And perhaps we don't have time to go into it in a huge amount of detail, but he basically asks, can you give a little more detail on how the KBAs are delineated? While it was reasonably easy to see how the IBAs were delineated, KBAs seem to now cover huge areas with a possible focus on protection. So maybe just a comment on how, if you have such a large KBA, to try and protect that area, if it's quite big, how one would go about doing that. No one's jumping.
Yeah,
Lisa, yeah.
I'll try and answer that question. So, Anthony, probably the hardest part of this process was the delineation of the sites, like making decisions where we draw the boundaries of the sites. And it is because in the IBAs, you're focusing just on birds. So you would have far fewer triggers at a site, and you know where they occur in the landscape, and you can make sure that you include the right habitats for those species. But when it comes to hundreds and hundreds of triggers and its ecosystems and its species, then it becomes quite challenging to decide where exactly to draw that line on the map. And it is a decision that we have to make. There's no specific rules other than that the site must be manageable as a unit. And so we have large sites in South Africa, or large KBAs, because we have very large protected areas. So if you think about the size of the Kruger Park or the Drakensberg National Park, they are huge areas, and it is possible to manage them as a single unit. And so we looked at areas where you have specifically large continuous areas of similar habitats that have similar species composition. We would include all of those areas ideally within a KBA. So if you think about Jarryd's Wakkerstroom example, it's a very specific kind of high-veld grassland with those wetland ecosystems, and those wetland ecosystems stretch over a very large area, and they've got their kind of catchments feeding them. And then we've also got those special species, like all those bird species, and then quite a number of endemic plant species to the Wakkerstroom area too. And so then we try to incorporate the habitat requirements of those species and the functionality of the ecosystem processes within that area that would kind of ensure its persistence. And that's often why we end up with fairly large sites.
That's, yeah, great explanation. Thanks very much for that.
Is there a sense of sort of the more area, the better, or would you say, like overall, is it a kind of an inclusive framework or something a bit more exclusive? Like, I don't know if that's a good question or not, but I'm just wondering.
So there's always this old saying in when we do biodiversity or conservation prioritization, if everything is important, then nothing is important, right? So we do have to make decisions about what is important. But in that sense, because we have these very clear criteria for the KBA network, we know exactly why a site is important for biodiversity, because we can go look up what's the criteria that it meets, and we can go look up what is the trigger species or ecosystems that meet the criteria. And so the key biodiversity areas, like I was explaining earlier about the bearded vulture, they are very focused on the triggers. The site must be of global importance for the persistence of triggers. So it's not just any site where you might have a patch of natural vegetation or like one or two individuals of a threatened species, because those are often, if you think in terms of long-term viability, the likelihood that such very small populations or species or very small patches of natural habitat will persist is much smaller than when you can rather get a large area of intact habitat that's a substantial proportion of the global extent of an ecosystem, or a substantial proportion of the global extent of a species, because that is more supportive of the global persistence of the species and then the local persistence of the species and ecosystems in that site. And so in that sense, it is exclusionary. And so also those white spaces on the map that was asked about earlier, it's not that there isn't any biodiversity there. It is just that the biodiversity doesn't meet these minimum thresholds for global importance. And so it is, in that sense, I would say it is a little bit of an exclusive process that we are applying here when we are using the criteria.
I suppose that's the whole point of the framework, really, is to try and make these kind of decisions a bit more objective and a bit more scientifically based, rather than maybe a sense of sentimentality or something like that that could creep in.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's all justified because it's measured against this global framework of criteria that we have to apply. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Lisa. I think we are going to wrap it up there. It is already 8:15. So thank you very much to all three of you for sticking around so long, and to all the audience members also for sticking with us. Before we close, does anyone have any last burning thoughts that they'd like to share with us? No?
3, 2, 1.
Good. Thank you very much. So yeah, all that remains is for me to thank Jarryd, Ernst, and Lisa very much for joining us this evening and for sharing your expertise. And thanks to Kurt for joining me in the hosting seat.
Yeah, you were looking a bit lonely out there sometimes, Christina. You needed some company. Thanks to everyone for joining.
Good.
Thanks, everybody.
And please do join us in 2 weeks' time for the next conservation conversations. And we'll leave it there. Good night, everyone, and thanks very much.
Cheers.